The 1930s were really the start of the comic book industry, what we know it as today. Comic strips by themselves had been around in the decade prior, depicting larger-than-life characters like Buck Rogers, Tarzan, and Popeye, just to name a few. Popeye was actually the first notable comic character to possess a form of superpowers, in this case, super strength, given to him by an outside source, i.e. canned spinach when eaten. The 1930s comic book industry saw a massive boom in popularity, igniting the era that would become known as the Golden Age of comic books, that lasted until 1950. The superhero archetype was introduced and ingrained within pop culture during this decade, and has since become a staple of the medium. Here are my picks for the most notable and iconic comic characters to come out of this decade. Number 5. Dick Tracy. Debuting in October of 1931, Dick Tracy was one of the earliest examples of the police procedural mystery story, which has since become a backbone of modern-day television, with the likes of Criminal Minds, Law & Order, NCIS, and much more. Tracy is a tough and cunning police detective who uses his wit to solve crimes and foil villainous schemes, sometimes even using advanced technology and gadgets similar to that of James Bond. His villains always had interesting nicknames usually related to their actions or physical appearances, like Big Boy, Breathless Mahoney, Flat Top, Mumbles, or Prune Face, which has to be the worst name you could possibly have. I feel bad for that guy. I think a lot of comic books and superhero stories owe a lot to the over-the-top nature of Dick Tracy, his villains, and the way he solved crimes. Any cat-and-mouse relationship between superheroes and supervillains owe a little bit to Dick Tracy, even a little bit. He made this type of thing popular. I mean, hell, Detective Comics was an entire series which had crime and mysteries as their backdrop, and that came out in 1937, so... Number 4. Captain Marvel. Now known simply as Shazam, Captain Marvel would become one of the most popular comic book characters of the 1940s, truly encapsulating what it meant to be a larger-than-life superhero for kids. He was so popular, in fact, that he even outsold the Man of Steel himself, probably one of the reasons DC would file a copyright infringement suit against Fawcett Comics in 1953, resulting in them obtaining ownership over Captain Marvel, because they believed he was a copy of Superman. Would they have still done it if he hadn't been outselling them? I wonder. Captain Marvel was created by artist Charles Beck and writer Bill Parker, and debuted for Fawcett Comics in December of 1939, meaning he just made it onto this list, being created at the very end of the decade. Another popular story that stems from Captain Marvel, especially with today's superhero craze, is that he shares the same name with a Marvel character that debuted in 1967. What happened? Why is he rarely referred to as Captain Marvel now, and instead Shazam? Well, when DC began publishing their Captain Marvel again in the 1970s, after their settlement with Fawcett Comics over a decade prior, yeah, DC stopped Fawcett from publishing the character and then buried it for a bit, cold. Marvel began establishing their own Captain Marvel and was able to swoop in and capture the trademark to the name. DC simply wanted to differentiate their character from Marvel's, because after all, they are completely different, so they named him Shazam, the word Billy Batson uses to transform himself into the godlike superhero. DC did attempt to name the returning comic series Shazam, the original Captain Marvel, but received a cease and desist order from Marvel, so yeah, just call him Shazam from now on, and there won't be any more confusion, hopefully. Number 3. The Phantom. In February of 1936, we saw the debut of the Phantom, created by Lee Falk. He's notable for being the first fictional hero to wear a skin-tight costume, as well as mask with no visible pupils, a staple of many superheroes today. His series of black and white comic strips have been published daily since 1936, along with a colorized one on Sundays, and are both still going strong today. In the 1960s, during his height of popularity, his strips were being read by over 100 million people worldwide, and we're talking before the days of internet here, with a character not owned by Marvel or DC. Damn, the Phantom was, and still is, a big deal in many countries. The cool thing about the Phantom is that he doesn't have any superpowers, and relies on his own strength and cunning to defeat his enemies. He is native to the fictional African country of Bengala, and is known as the Ghost Who Walks, believed by many to be immortal, though in actuality, the Phantom identity is simply passed on in his family through generation to generation. It's an interesting concept. He does occasionally use pistols, and possesses 2 phantom rings, one called the Good Mark on his left hand, which he uses to place people under his protection, and on the other, the Skull Mark, or Evil Mark, which scars his victims with his skull shape when he punches them with it. Much like Batman, the Phantom embraces his infamy and myth, and uses that fear against his opponents. Number 2. Batman. He needs no introduction. Batman is one of the most beloved comic book characters of all time, and in my honest opinion, he is the greatest fictional hero ever conceived. Ever since debuting in Detective Comics number 27 in March of 1939, Batman has been one of the most financially bankable characters in the genre, and his popularity quickly led to merchandise of all kinds, a live-action TV series during the introduction and boom of color television, and several live-action films. The 1966 one, starring the late Adam West, was the first legitimate mainstream superhero film, not counting all the serials and everything before it. I think Batman and really Marvel's Spider-Man 2 are the gateway drugs to superheroes for many younger audiences. I know they were the first I really gave a shit about until I decided to pursue the rest. There's something magical about that. They really embody the genre and earn their legacies. Do I need to really say more? Before I get to my number 1 pick, here are some honorable mentions. First is Flash Gordon, who debuted within his own comic strip in January 1934. He has been adapted into various animated cartoons over the years, and even a terrible yet oddly fascinating live-action film in 1980, starring Sam S. Jones. Mandrake the Magician was another character created by Lee Falk and was published alongside the Phantom and Flash Gordon by King Features Syndicate. He was a magician who used illusions and hypnosis to stop criminals. Mandrake is regarded by many as the very first comic book superhero, debuting in 1934, but I would still consider the Phantom as that, because to me, the classic superhero is one with a flashy skin-tight costume, and he was the first to do that. And the number 1 best comic character of the 1930s is Superman. I'm always going to be a Batman fan at heart, he's my boy, but any follower of superheroes and comic books in general would be foolish not to admit that Superman is the true grandfather of all superheroes. Yes, Popeye introduced superpowers, the Phantom, the skin-tight costume and mask, but Superman took these foundations and ran with them, making the genre a household name and evolving it into what we see today. Before I start this video discussing the top 5 best comic characters of the 1940s, I need to address a mistake I made in my first video focusing on the 1930s. For some strange reason I can't explain, I failed to mention the character of the Shadow, created by Walter B. Gibson and published by Street and Smith Publications. I wouldn't have included him on my actual list, but I should have said something about the character in my honorable mentions section, and for that I do apologize. The Shadow was one of the more popular pulp icons in 1930s America, and was very influential to the superhero genre, especially Batman. Now that all that is cleared up, here's my video on the 1940s. Enjoy! Now that comic books were firmly established within mainstream media and popular culture, the 1940s saw even more of a boom, especially in the superhero genre. These types of characters were popping up everywhere as comic book companies seek to cash in on this newfound craze. The looming threat of World War II in Europe for the first half of the decade caused some corners of the medium to dip into the realm of propaganda, unfortunately, which did hold it back a fair bit. comics were trying to uplift morale, rally troops, and sell war bonds, among other things. Today, I'll be counting down my picks for the top 5 best characters to come out of comics in the 1940s decade. If I miss any of your favorites, or ones you believe should have been on here, be sure to leave them in the comments section down below. Number 5. Robin, Dick Grayson. 1940 saw the first appearance of Batman's sidekick Robin, the Boy Wonder, in that April's Detective Comics number 38, a little over a year after Batman's official debut. It was the very first incarnation of the character, named Dick Grayson, who shared a very similar backstory to that of Bruce Wayne, with both his parents, members of the acrobatic family, the Flying Graysons, murdered by a gangster named Tony Zuko after he sabotaged their trapeze ropes at the circus they performed in. Batman and Robin are simply iconic, instantly recognizable to anyone young and old. Without Robin making up the second half of the dynamic duo, and everything the two accomplished together over the years, I don't know where the superhero genre would be at today. Dick Grayson would eventually grow older and out from behind the shadow of the Dark Knight, becoming his own form of crime fighter named Nightwing. But this wouldn't happen until the 1980s, and in my opinion, despite how cool Nightwing may be, his time as Robin will always overshadow his time as Nightwing in terms of significance and impact. Dick Grayson's Robin is one of the most memorable and influential characters in comic book history. I mean, he started the classic sidekick trope. Number 4. Aquaman. This character has evolved quite a lot over the years because DC has had a lot of difficulty maintaining his appeal among mainstream audiences. For the longest time, he was viewed as a joke due to his countless kid-friendly animated appearances, riding seahorses and the like. It also didn't help that the only power that was usually on display was his ability to talk to fish, and that's about it. Thankfully, in recent years, Aquaman has been breaking ground, and I find a lot of new fans making their way to his stories. I think a lot of it has to do with his recent incarnations in DC's New 52 and Rebirth continuities that have really built the character from the ground up again, and I recommend anyone curious about Aquaman to check them out because many of them are pretty great. Debuting in 1941, Aquaman is a hero that has a strong and unwavering moral compass, who acts as king of the underwater nation of Atlantis. He seeks to bring peace to his city and strengthen the relationship between his people and humans, despite all the crazy schemes that have happened trying to prevent that. With both Atlantean and human blood, he acts as the link between the two worlds. He may have been a silly idea at first, but I think Aquaman has become one of the true greats of superheroism. Number 3. Captain America. Captain America has come a long way since his early days in comics, when he was nothing more than shallow propaganda. Regardless of this character's backstory and how well written or drawn the stories were by his creators Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, he debuted during the height of World War II, and wearing an American flag as a costume, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize what the purpose of these comics really were. Back then, Captain America was published by Timely Comics, which would then be rebranded as Atlas Comics and then later Marvel. Captain America was really the first major superhero by the publisher, or at least the first one that went the distance. However, I don't think the character really hit his stride until his revival in 1964 with Avengers number 4. This is when Captain America truly began, in my opinion. All the World War II stuff is throwaway now, because many of it has not aged very well. It's offensive to modern audiences, and can easily be told in much less tasteless ways, with simple flashbacks in today's comics. Anyways, Captain America has become a staple superhero of Marvel Comics, and one of the brand's biggest draws, mostly influenced by his success in the Marvel Cinematic Universe of films now. Despite his patriotic costume and mindset, and trusty shield bearing the symbol of America, the old stars and stripes, he represents so much more than that. Captain America is the everyman turned extraordinary. He fights for the little guy and stands up to bullies of all kinds. Number 2. The Joker. Batman's arch-nemesis and Gotham's clown prince of crime, who debuted in Batman number 1 in April of 1940, with an appearance modeled after Conrad Veidt's character, Gwynplaine from the 1928 silent film The Man Who Laughs. For decades, the Joker has been one of the most popular characters in all of DC Comics, and one of the most beloved supervillains in the entire genre. His unpredictable nature and want to cause chaos makes him a force to be reckoned with in almost every depiction we've seen of him. Despite this, my relationship with this character has evolved a lot over time. While I think he's the greatest villain ever conceived in comic books, he isn't my personal favorite, nor do I enjoy him as much as I used to. Don't get me wrong, in the versions I do enjoy, like Mark Hamill's from Batman the Animated Series, Jack Nicholson's from the 1989 Batman film, and Heath Ledger's from The Dark Knight, just to name a few, I do find this character's popularity doing more harm than good to many Batman stories. DC seems to force him into too many as of late due to popular demand, but I think too much of anything is a bad thing, regardless of how subjectively good it is to begin with. I still love this character, and like I said, he's probably the best supervillain there is. However, when I was younger, everything he seemed to touch turned to gold. Now, not so much. I would say more about the Joker here, but maybe I'll leave that for a future revamped supervillain breakdown or something. Let's move on to the honorable mentions. Okay, so I've got a lot of honorable mentions here because a lot of iconic characters made their debuts in the 1940s, and have remained major fixtures of the comic book and superhero genre, even today. I'll try to list them by year if I can. We have Catwoman, one of the greatest femme fatales, the first incarnation of Clayface, Basil Karlo, the Sorcerer, Dr. Fate, the Jay Garrick Flash, the early stages of a character that would become much greater later on down the road, and the immensely powerful Spectre, who gives evildoers their just desserts. All these characters debuted in 1940. Then we have Archie Andrews, Green Arrow, the Penguin, Plastic Man, Ares, the Red Skull, and one of my personal favorites, the Scarecrow, from 1941. One of Batman's greatest adversaries, Two-Face, would make his appearance in 1942, one of Superman's iconic foes, Mr. Mxyzptlk, in 1944, and finally, Black Adam from Captain Marvel, first appearing in 1945. I also want to bring up the Justice Society of America, which debuted in late 1940 and was the spiritual predecessor and inspiration for DC's staple superhero faction, the Justice League, which would appear in 1960. I told myself before I began this series that I wanted to focus on individual characters and not teams, but Justice League, as well as one other, which will come later, are the only exceptions, and they will only be featured in the honorable mention sections and not the main lists. And the number one greatest comic character to come out of the 1940s is Wonder Woman, the third of DC's Trinity. So this might be a bit of a controversial or unpopular choice, I don't really know, but my pick for the best and most influential comic character of the 1940s would have to be that of Wonder Woman, who debuted in All-Star Comics number 8 in October of 1941. Though her creator, psychologist and inventor William Moulton Marston is known for his polyamorous relationship with two women who both had children with him while all three lived together, and the comics featuring Wonder Woman in the 1940s left a lot to be desired, usually depicting themes related to love, submission, and bondage, I do still believe the impact this character has had over time, and the influence she has had on women all around the world, is what truly cements Wonder Woman as one of the biggest legends in the comic book industry. Unfortunately, much like Captain America, I find this character's early years to be a bit tainted due to the strong emphasis on stories set during World War II. Many of them are now outdated, and in some instances are bordering on propaganda, though it's much more tame and less obvious compared to that of Captain America's stories, at least in my opinion. Since her inception, Wonder Woman has been a symbol of strength, heroism, and an inspiration for feminists everywhere. I admit, extreme feminism can be annoying because, quite frankly, the world needs both sexes to function. For some reason people seem to forget that, but if you push that aside for 1 second and relax, then you would have to agree that Wonder Woman is by far one of the best DC characters ever conceived, and one of the greatest comic book characters of all time. Before I begin this video, I have to correct mistakes yet again. I feel so ashamed. The Spirit, Lex Luthor, Solomon Grundy, and Red Skull all debuted in the 1940s, and I failed to mention them in the past video for one reason or another. Out of them all, Lex Luthor should have definitely been on the actual list. I apologize for that blunder. Luthor is one of the most iconic and influential supervillains in the medium, paving the way for similar characters that fit his mold. Now, I hope I can move on to the 1950s and not miss anyone of note. I feel it's inevitable though. Expect another apology soon. We have now entered the 1950s. Gone was the outdated World War II baggage that heavily influenced the content found within many of the prominent superhero stories like Captain America and Wonder Woman in the first half of the 1940s decade, and now, the genre and industry as a whole was free to grow and develop. The sky was truly the limit, or so it seemed. DC Comics had firmly established itself as the largest and most profitable comic book distributor in North America. With the combined sales of Batman and Superman, nothing could stand in their way. Today, let's take a look at the very best comic characters the 1950s decade brought us. If I miss any of your favorites, or ones you believe were more influential, be sure to leave them in the comments section down below. Let's begin. Number 5. The Crypt Keeper. Tales from the Crypt isn't a superhero comic book series, but they are some of the most influential titles in the medium, along with the Vault of Horror and the Haunt of Fear, which were all anthology comics that told several short stories related to the supernatural, occult, and horror genres. Tales from the Crypt and subsequent series were published by EC Comics between 1950 and 1955, and were known for their much darker and mature content compared to that of their contemporaries, which made them stand out. They were fairly popular among comic book readers. I mentioned at the beginning of this video that the 1950s decade allowed the comic book and superhero genre to grow and develop, and that the sky was the limit. Well, that's not exactly true. In 1954, comic books were attacked by parents, librarians, and other notable officials due to their possible bad influence on youth. They believed comics were a major cause of juvenile delinquency, and there were even congressional hearings to discuss the issue. Though comics had been criticized ever since their inception, viewed upon as a trashy and immature form of entertainment, it wasn't until the 1950s that the industry was greatly affected by the backlash. After the hearings, the now infamous Comics Code Authority was put in place, which monitored and censored all content found within our cherished and beloved comics. Anything from policemen and other government officials being viewed upon in a negative light, excessive violence, nudity, sexual themes, blood, gore, criminals and criminal activity given sympathy, women drawn in unrealistic ways, profanity, all these things were completely prohibited. The saddest of all, though, is that the amazing Tales from the Crypt stories and related titles took the brunt of the impact because any use of the words horror and terror in comics were no longer allowed, and any references to monsters, ghouls, vampires, torture, cannibalism, etc. was completely banned. Due to the immense constraints, EC Comics was forced to end their amazing series in September of that year, and despite a live-action series being made based on the comics and the fact that EC Comics is still in business due to their Mad Magazine line, the mid-1950s was by far the darkest time in comic book history. The Comics Code Authority would eventually meet its demise, but the tragedy and pain it caused is still felt by many fans of the medium today. I plan on doing a longer video on the topic in the near future, so stay tuned. Anyways, let's finally get back to the Crypt Keeper. He was one of the 3 hosts of these scary stories found within the Tales from the Crypt comics, along with the Old Witch and Vault Keeper. The character is by far the best of the 3, and is synonymous with the Tales from the Crypt name. Having your comic possess an identity in this way makes it all the more memorable, and the character has appeared in various animated and live-action adaptations of the series over the years. Number 4. Martian Manhunter. Sorry that last one took so long. There was a lot to go over. Let's move on to my number 4 pick, the Manhunter from Mars himself, John Johns. Debuting in Detective Comics number 225 in November of 1955, the Martian Manhunter is one of the strongest characters in the DC universe, and one of the founding members of the Justice League. Johns is an extraterrestrial from Mars, and is usually depicted as the last of his kind, due to some sort of threat wiping out his species. He is transported to Earth via teleportation or a spaceship, depending on the story and continuity, and finds solace among the people of Earth, as well as friendship with the other members of the Justice League. In many ways, he is similar to Superman in that he struggles to fit in at times, even more so than the Man of Steel, because he was at least raised by a family on Earth and grew up in these surroundings. John's wasn't. Martian Manhunter possesses the ability to fly, shapeshift, heal, go invisible, and generate heat vision out of his eyes. Just like Superman, he also has a form of kryptonite, in his case, fire. In fact, he has pyrophobia due to witnessing his entire race die by it. Number 3. Supergirl. There have been a few variations to this character over the years, but the main one I want to focus on is Kara Zor-El, who debuted as Supergirl in Action Comics number 252 in May of 1959. There was an earlier one that popped up in Superman number 123 the previous year, who was a being wished into existence by Jimmy Olsen, but it was simply a way for DC to gauge the audience's response to a female version of Superman before they went and created Supergirl, so I'm not going to count it. Kara Zor-El is the biological cousin of Superman, Kal-El, who survived the destruction of their home planet of Krypton by being sent away by her parents in a small spacecraft, much in the same way Superman was in order to escape its fate. In most versions, her spacecraft is knocked off course and is found by Superman, now an adult, many years later. Despite being older than Kal-El back on Krypton, Supergirl hasn't aged, because her body was in a form of suspended animation. She possesses all the same powers Superman does, and in some instances, appears stronger than he is, because Kara has not learned how to suppress her abilities as much as Superman has, with the many years he has spent on Earth. Number 2. Green Lantern, Hal Jordan. There was an original Green Lantern character named Alan Scott, who debuted in All-American Comics number 16 from July of 1940, which I didn't mention in my previous video. The main reason? I just didn't feel like it because I'm not a big fan of this character, and knew I would have to bring him up here, so here he is. Alan Scott used a special ring that gave him magical abilities, and was recharged with the aid of a Green Lantern. These ideas would be the framework for a much greater idea down the road. Fast forward to DC Showcase number 22 in October of 1959, with the debut of a newly refurbished character, Hal Jordan, taking on the name and likeness of the Green Lantern hero. Jordan was a member of the Green Lantern Corps, an intergalactic law enforcement team that wielded the power of green light. As the years progressed, the idea would be expanded upon, adding in several other types of Lantern Corps, which are now part of a larger emotional spectrum of color. Each Corps was given a leader, a form of spirit animal or creature, and even abilities unique to that spectrum. Honestly, I love this concept, and it's one of my favorites in all of comics. I plan on doing the next superhero breakdown on Green Lantern, so stay tuned. Here are a bunch of honorable mentions in the year in which they debuted. First, we have Charlie Brown and Snoopy debuting in 1950. That same year, Deadshot, who looked much different than the hitman he would later become. Astro Boy, Dennis the Menace, and a personal favorite of mine, Killer Moth, would make their first appearances in 1951. The pyromaniac Firefly debuted in 1952, once again much different than his current version. Richie Rich in 1953, Bizarro and Calendar Man in 1958, and why not, Batmite in 1959. And the number one greatest comic character of the 1950s is The Flash. One of DC's most iconic superheroes, The Flash, debuted in October of 1956, among the pages of DC Showcase number 4. I'm of course referring to the Barry Allen version of the character, which was a reinvention of an earlier idea planted in the character of Jay Garrick, who debuted in 1940. Barry Allen is usually depicted as a member of the Central City Police Department who works on the forensics team. He has the ability to tap into the Speed Force, which is basically a universe in another plane of existence that speedsters like the Flash tap into, allowing them to break the laws of physics. Speedsters can run at superhuman speeds, faster than light, and even travel through time with the help of a device known as the Cosmic Treadmill. When a speedster dies, he becomes one with the Speed Force, so it acts like a form of Valhalla as well. The Barry Allen Flash is one of the most impactful deaths in comic book history. In 1985's Crisis on Infinite Earths, Barry Allen stops the Anti-Monitor's antimatter cannon by creating a speed vortex to weaken it. However, the power is sucked in, and Allen is killed because his body is overcome by it. The events of Crisis on Infinite Earths was a reboot of the entire DC continuity at the time. Later, in 2011, the Flashpoint storyline acted as a reboot in much of the same way, caused by the Flash as well, which led to the New 52 line. So really, the Flash is DC's reset button. Let's not forget many of his iconic villains that debuted in the 1950s too, such as Captain Cold in 1957, and Gorilla Grodd, Pied Piper, and Weather Wizard, who all made their first appearances in 1959. If I don't mention them, people will lose their minds. Throughout the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and first half of the 1960s, DC Comics was the highest-selling comic book distributor in North America, with the combined might of Superman and Batman in their pocket, who were usually dominating the sales figures. It seemed like nothing could stop them, but then something happened. Atlas Comics, who had formerly been known as Timely Comics in the 1940s, that were most known for their Western, romance, giant monster, medieval, Bible, and war-related stories, would rebrand themselves Marvel Comics in 1961, originally shown as a small box with an MC on it, and would reach into this yet untapped realm of superheroes. They had made the Human Torch, Namor the Submariner, and Captain America in the decades prior, but they usually stuck with what they knew best, the genres I just listed. However, a writer and editor for Marvel Comics named Stan Lee saw the success of characters like The Flash, Green Lantern, and the freshly debuted Justice League of America from DC, and wanted to capitalize on the popularity of superheroes. He went against many conventions found within the genre at the time, making the comics and their storylines target a wider audience, both young and old, and their heroes facing real-life problems people faced every day. In that sense, they felt more fleshed out and relatable. Today, let's look at the top 5 best comic characters to come out of the 1960s decade. I hate to break it to you, but DC won't be on this list. The 1960s were dominated by Marvel Comics in terms of creative flow. They made timeless character after timeless character, and around 1966, they would take the throne from DC, becoming the new sheriff in town. Their sales would usually surpass DC's throughout this time, and they haven't looked back since. Number 5. The Incredible Hulk. I'll discuss more of this character in a future superhero breakdown, but the Hulk is without a doubt one of the most recognizable Marvel heroes ever created. He debuted in May of 1962 and was inspired by Mary Shelley's Frankenstein monster. The Fantastic Four's Thing had become increasingly popular among fans, and writer Stan Lee wanted to create another character that would be viewed as imperfect by the outside world, a misunderstood monster you could get behind. Originally, the Hulk was colored gray because Lee didn't want any particular ethnic group believing Marvel was targeting them in any way with their stories. The gray color was also a problem for the printing press, as its shade would fluctuate from image to image. So, shortly afterwards, in issue 2, the Hulk's color was changed from gray to green, further reinforcing his Frankenstein roots. Before I move on to number 4, let's not forget some of his iconic villains that debuted in the 1960s as well, like the Leader and Abomination. They both deserve mentioning. Number 4. Daredevil. One of my favorite Marvel characters debuted in April of 1964, that character being the man without fear himself, Daredevil. Though his first several appearances depicted him in a yellow costume akin to those worn by acrobats, his iconic red design would be featured a year later, in issue 7, where he fought Namor the Submariner. Batman has always been my favorite superhero, and I think I enjoy Daredevil because his character is very similar in tone to the Dark Knight. Much like Bruce Wayne, he lost his parents at a young age, in this case his father, and his stories discuss themes related to loss, tragedy, psychological trauma, vigilantism, etc. I'm not religious, but I also find the way it analyzes the fine line between what's righteous and what's evil to be very unique as well. What's good and bad isn't always black and white, and I think Daredevil fully embraces that. It's very thought-provoking, which is what I like in my comics. Number 3. The Fantastic Four. Marvel's first family, debuting in November of 1961, the Fantastic Four predate all of Marvel's iconic superheroes, and started a trend which would become a staple of the brand moving forward. Now, Marvel had created Namor the Submariner, Captain America, and the first Human Torch in the decades prior, but the Fantastic Four were the first to use the true Marvel superhero formula we know of today. All those characters I previously mentioned were fairly insignificant for all intents and purposes, and all products of their time in some way. Each one was either replaced, rebranded, or retconned to fit the new Marvel mold of the 1960s. It has been widely known that Stan Lee was going to leave the comic book business if it weren't for the success of the Fantastic Four. The unique and dynamic relationship of the team made them stand out from every other superhero in the medium at that time. They were a family, husband, wife, brother, friend. It made them more relatable to readers. The Fantastic Four really shaped what would become not only Marvel Comics, but the entire genre as a whole. It changed how these stories were told. It made them more believable and realistic, despite the exaggerated powers and abilities of its characters. Without the Fantastic Four, superheroes would be a lot different. Comic books would be a lot different. Once again, I should list some of their villains that debuted in the 1960s, such as Doctor Doom, Galactus, and the ever-underrated Annihilus. They have a special place in every comic book fan's heart. At least, I hope. Number 2. The Uncanny X-Men. I really wanted to put the Fantastic Four as number 2 because of how significant they were to the comic book and superhero genre, but one thing that puts the X-Men over them is the fact that they were more influential in terms of cultural significance, not just with the medium itself, but the message they promoted. Ever since their debut in September of 1963, the Uncanny X-Men have been a metaphor for prejudice of all kinds. Racism, religion, diversity, sexuality, genocide, all these serious topics have been discussed in X-Men comics over the years, to varying degrees, with more and more of them being introduced and analyzed as society itself changes. The X-Men and their stories are some of the best across the medium, and have helped introduce these concepts and ideologies to young and old alike, with all of us hopefully growing in knowledge and acceptance in the process. Another villain roll call: Magneto, Blob, Quicksilver, Scarlet Witch, Juggernaut, and the Sentinels. They all debuted in the 1960s, and all served a strong purpose within X-Men stories, many of which bringing along their own host of interesting topics to discuss. Okay, here are a lot of honorable mentions in no particular order, because the 1960s were literally on fire in terms of superheroes and comic books. We have Hank Pym, the Ant-Man, the God of Thunder, Thor, his trickster brother Loki, Doctor Strange, Iron Man, Black Panther, Ultron, and from DC we have Batgirl, Reverse Flash, Ocean Master, Black Manta, and the always amazing and highly underrated Conqueror of Worlds, Starro. All these characters have been great additions to the superhero genre, and have all been influential over the years in their own way. And the number one best comic character to come out of the 1960s decade is The Amazing Spider-Man. I don't think I have to explain myself with this one. Peter Parker, Spider-Man, is one of the greatest superheroes ever conceived, and is arguably one of, if not the, most popular and recognizable superheroes on the face of the earth. He has been for several decades, and will remain for many, many years to come. I really don't want to go into his origin story here, because we all know it by now, and I want to save a more in-depth discussion for a superhero breakdown video in the future. But know that he is one of the most relatable heroes out there, because he deals with issues a lot of people his age do. rent, relationships, keeping a job, balancing his school life with that of a superhero, if the story still depicts him in school, that is. Despite having all these amazing powers, he's just like you or me, and can't seem to catch a break. Life isn't perfect, and neither should one of a superhero. Much like the Fantastic Four, I believe Spider-Man helped shape what these stories would become in the future, across the entire medium. And once again, let's mention a few of his villains that debuted in the 1960s. The majority of his major ones did, like the Chameleon, the Lizard, Dr. Octopus, Sandman, Vulture, Scorpion, Green Goblin, Kraven the Hunter, Mysterio, Rhino, the Shocker, Kingpin, Electro, I mean goddamn. Comic books in the 1970s began to shift in thematic focus. In the decades prior, stories leaned more towards the exuberant, with the whole concept of superheroes being shown in a sensationalized way. Characters, costumes, abilities, it was all dramatized and shown as larger than life. Like many art forms in the 1970s, comics began to reflect the civil unrest found within society at the time. Campaigns for change were happening all across North America, and social progressive values, such as racial equality, feminism, and the war on drugs, were just some of the many social issues brought up and discussed during this time. The name given to this era in comics is the Bronze Age, but I like to think of it as the age shit got real. Now, the fantastical elements from the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s were still present in superhero stories, don't get me wrong, but now they were dealing with problems society was facing too, depicting things that would have been viewed as untouchable in the decades prior. The stories themselves began to include darker imagery and ideas as well, centering around death and loss. The heroes weren't always victorious. In many ways, comics were becoming more grounded and realistic. Writers and artists were able to get away with so much more than they could before. Today, let's count down the top 5 best comic characters to come out of the 1970s. If I miss any of your favorites or ones you believe should have been on my list, be sure to leave them in the comments section down below. Starting the list off at number 5 is Swamp Thing, one of my favorite DC superheroes. I love this guy, or I guess, thing. Swamp Thing was a scientist named Alec Holland, who was working on a biorestorative formula within a secret facility located in the Louisiana swamplands. A bomb planted by criminals explodes and causes a fire in the facility. Holland is covered in his own formula and runs into the swamp to put out the flames. Instead, the chemicals react with the swamp's plant life, combining it with Holland's consciousness and memories. It forms a new being, a kind of swamp monster that fights for not only his boggy home, but the Earth's environment in general. Swamp Thing is such a lovable character in my opinion. His natural, peaceful demeanor, unless provoked of course, is admirable, and his want to save the environment, I mean, come on, that's nice of him. His introduction came at a time when the Comics Code Authority began to weaken, and stories involving monsters and the supernatural were becoming popular once again. For number 4, I chose the hero for hire, Luke Cage, also known as Power Man, that debuted in June of 1972. Though Black Panther had made his first appearance for Marvel in 1966, and is widely considered to be the first mainstream superhero of African descent, Luke Cage was the first black superhero to be the title character of his own comic book. Black Panther didn't get his own series until 1977. Luke Cage debuted during the height of blaxploitation films in the 1970s that began portraying black characters as central protagonists as opposed to villains and sidekicks like they had been depicted as countless times before. Luke Cage stories centered on the streets, depicted a crime-heavy New York City, discussed race relations, and even the war on drugs. They had a lot to say at the time, and the character has managed to evolve along with society over the years, and it makes sense. At number 3 we have Frank Castle, the Punisher. He's notable in that he redefined what a superhero could be. He was an entirely new breed. Motivated by the death of his family, he would use his military background and skills to torture, kidnap, murder, and extort his enemies. The Punisher doesn't play by the rules of your typical hero, and it's for that reason that he really isn't one, more of an anti-hero than anything. In his original stories, Frank Castle was depicted as a Vietnam War veteran and debuted in comics a little over a year before the conflict ended, so guns, violence, war, peace, it was all in the minds of Americans at that time and would have planted the seeds for this kind of character. At number 2 we have Ra's al Ghul, another character that fights for the environment, sort of like Swamp Thing, wanting balance, but is willing to exterminate the majority of humanity to accomplish it. Debuting in June of 1971, Ra's al Ghul has become one of Batman's most prominent enemies, leading the terrorist group known as the League of Assassins, or League of Shadows, or Society of Shadows, depending on what story or adaptation you're looking at. He's just a great character, and if you want more info on him, as well as my own thoughts on him, check out my breakdown I did a while back. Before we get to my number 1, here are some honorable mentions. Darkseid, the ruler of Apokolips, who debuted in 1970, Man-Thing, and Morbius the Living Vampire from 1971, Ghost Rider in 1972, Blade, Howard the Duck, and Thanos making their first appearances in 1973, Iron Fist in 1974, Moon Knight and Captain Canuck in 1975, Bullseye and Jigsaw in 1976, Sabretooth and 2000 AD's Judge Dredd from 1977, Mystique in 1978, and finally Black Cat from Spider-Man in 1979. As you can see, there was quite a bit from this decade, and all of them are memorable in their own ways. But without a doubt, my number 1 pick for best comic character from the 1970s decade would have to be Wolverine from the X-Men. Much like Punisher, he emerged from the ashes of the Vietnam War, and there was now an interest in these types of brutal, anti-heroic characters within North American comics. Wolverine is one of the most popular and recognizable characters in comic book history. He deserves the top spot on this list for that reason alone. But he's also one of the more notable Canadian characters as well, which gets him a few extra brownie points for me too. The 1980s saw the birth of the modern age of comic books, also referred to as the Dark Age. It marked a revitalization of sorts for DC Comics, who had been suffering from a slump in their sales since the late 1960s, when Marvel became a major competitor after it experienced a massive boom in creativity, dropping iconic character after iconic character after iconic character. Following their epic crossover, Crisis on Infinite Earths, DC had become a strong contender yet again. It was during this time that countless iconic characters were being deconstructed and re-envisioned as well, like Batman and Superman among the pages of Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns. The superhero genre itself was also satirized in storylines like Watchmen by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. All in all, comics were becoming darker and more serious than ever before. They weren't afraid of crossing lines. It was awesome. Join me as I count down my picks for the top 5 best comic characters to come out of the 1980s decade. Like always, this is my list, but if I missed any of your favorites or ones you feel should have been included, be sure to leave them in the comments section down below. At number 5, I'm choosing The Rocketeer, created by Dave Stevens. I think he's always been a very interesting and underrated character with a lot of potential. For those of you unfamiliar with him, The Rocketeer is a racing and stunt pilot by the name of Cliff Secord, who discovers a jetpack hidden by 2 gangsters fleeing police and becomes a hero of sorts. The Rocketeer is an homage to serial films of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and was even made into a live-action film in 1991, one of my personal favorites, might I add. It's a hidden gem. With number 4, I have to go with the Watchmen, all of them. Night Owl, Ozymandias, Silk Spectre, the Comedian, Dr. Manhattan, and Rorschach. They're all memorable characters in their own ways, and the Watchmen storyline itself is considered one of the greatest comics and graphic novels ever written. So, yeah. Next up at number 3 is En Sabah Nur, Apocalypse. Debuting in mid-1986, Apocalypse is one of my favorite villains in all of comics, and he's easily one of Marvel's most badass. I did a breakdown of him a while back if you want to check it out. There's a lot of great stuff to this character. Venom is number 2 here, and you knew he'd be on this list, you just knew it. Eddie Brock, Venom, is one of the most recognizable and popular characters in the entire comic book medium. He has this edge to him, this cool factor, that is hard to replicate. Brock's Venom is a massive, violent, testosterone-fueled beast, but he's also got some heroic qualities to him as well, which is why he's so interesting. Venom is the yin to Spider-Man's yang, and acts as one of the web-slinger's countless archenemies. It's time for some honorable mentions. We've got Deathstroke, She-Hulk, and Taskmaster that all debuted in 1980, Killer Croc, Lobo, and Hobgoblin emerging in 1983, Dick Grayson becoming Nightwing for the first time in 1984, Black Mask, John Constantine, and Mojo making their first appearances in 1985, The Ventriloquist and Scarface in 1988, and two personal favorites of mine, Crossbones and Anarchy, making their debuts in 1989. All these characters are great, but I feel the ones I've listed already are more noteworthy or made larger impacts in the grander scheme of things, at least to me. And at number 1, I'd have to go with the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles by Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird. Originally intended to be a single-issue comic book released in 1983, parodying the likes of Marvel's Daredevil, The New Mutants, Frank Miller's Ronin, and Dave Sims' Cerebus, the series would quickly expand into other forms of media, having an animated cartoon start up in 1987 and an action figure line through Playmates Toys. The Turtles skyrocketed to mainstream success in the late 1980s and early 90s, and have since become some of the most recognizable and beloved characters of all time, with generation after generation being introduced to them in some new way. And let's not forget their iconic villains that debuted in the 1980s along with them. Shredder, Bebop, Rocksteady, and Krang all have a special place in our hearts. Moving on to the 1990s, we know that this was a tough time for the comic book industry. It almost sunk entirely due to the comic book crash happening about midway through the decade, despite there being more mainstream appeal with comics than ever before, surprisingly. There was just an oversaturation of comics on the market, which caused the majority to lose their value. Mainstream media targeted the money-making potential of rare comics, and publishers began utilizing pointless gimmicks that were mainly just cosmetic in nature, like special polybags, or holofoil and glow-in-the-dark covers to upsell them. The entire landscape of the industry was changing, and I think there was a disconnect between the publisher and consumer. Everything was being thrown at the wall to see what stuck. So much of it was forgettable or downright ridiculous. Anyways, let's count down the top 5 best comic characters to come out of the 1990s decade. Though it was a dark time for the industry and medium, there were a few bright spots, and I'm gonna list them. Here we go. Starting off the list with the Powerhouse Bane, who debuted in a big way, breaking the spine of Batman in the 1993-1994 storyline Nightfall, one of my favorites. Bane was different than a lot of other brutes we knew in comics at the time, because not only was he strong, but he had the brains to back it up. Though he hasn't made much of an impact in comics since the events of Nightfall, apart from the odd appearance here and there, his debut was unforgettable, because he did what no other Batman villain could do up until that point, successfully break the Bat. Next on the list at number 4 would be Cletus Kasady, Carnage. This symbiote is the offspring of Venom, and was the best character of his kind to be created following him. Debuting in April of 1992, Carnage quickly made a name for himself and showed off his more unstable, unpredictable, and extremely violent tendencies. He's stronger than both Spider-Man and Venom combined, due to his symbiote tapping into his psychopathic behaviors, and it's red in color due to it bonding with Kasady's bloodstream. For number 3, I chose Deadpool. When he debuted among the pages of the New Mutants number 98 in February of 1991, he was depicted as a supervillain, a mercenary targeting Nathan Summers' Cable due to a bounty placed on his head. While he did crack a few subtle jokes here and there, it was far removed from the fourth wall-breaking stuff we know from him today. Over the decades, Deadpool became more of an anti-hero. The Merc with the Mouth is one of the most popular in the superhero genre today. At number 2, we have Harley Quinn. She made her first appearance in the Batman animated series episode Joker's Favor, which originally aired in September of 1992. A year later, she would make her way into the comics in issue 12 of the Batman Adventures based off the series, and then officially being added in to the rest of the Dark Knight's comic book canon with Batman Harley Quinn in October of 1999, part of the No Man's Land crossover. Since her inception, Harley has become one of the most popular characters in the DC universe, and her popularity doesn't seem to be fading anytime soon. Here we go with some honorable mentions. First, the Men in Black, originally published by Aircel Comics, which were then bought out by Malibu, and then later, Marvel. Sailor Moon, an immensely popular Japanese manga heroine who debuted in December of 1991. Doomsday, Omega Red, and Victor Zsasz, who made their first appearances in 1992, Mike Mignola's Hellboy in 1993, and the personification of death for speedsters in the DC Universe, Black Flash in 1998. But to close off the list at number 1, we have Todd McFarlane's Spawn, the greatest comic character found outside of Marvel and DC in my opinion. Spawn was the brainchild of McFarlane after he and a group of other artists left Marvel in the early 90s to form Image Comics. Spawn was a U.S. Marine turned CIA assassin named Al Simmons who was killed by his partner and friend Bruce Stinson, codenamed Chapel, under the direct orders of Jason Wynn. Simmons is sent to Hell, where he makes a deal with the devil Malbolgia, agreeing to serve as his Hellspawn and command his army, but not before he can see his wife one last time. After being sent back to Earth, Simmons becomes the anti-hero Spawn, in order to stop the forces of evil. His powers are fueled by necroplasm, and if depleted, indicated by a cool timer, he will be forced to return to Hell, something he obviously doesn't want to do. So, Simmons uses as little of the necroplasm as possible, which is why he frequently makes use of firearms. Again, Spawn is the best comic character outside of Marvel and DC, and in the 1990s especially, he was quite popular. He's my pick for the greatest comic character to come out of that decade by far. Hopefully, you agree. Moving forward into the new millennium, the comic book industry was in constant flux. The mainstream appeal of comics, or more specifically the characters within them, were higher than ever before, thanks in part to media forms outside of comics, such as cartoons and live-action film. Even though comic books themselves weren't selling as much as they used to, at least superhero ones, a trend we would see moving into the 2010s as well, the industry had a decent financial safety net now, and the IPs were worth more than ever. Marvel had sold the film rights to some of their characters to Fox, Universal, and Sony in the late 1990s to stay afloat, and the company itself would be purchased by Disney in 2009, bringing along with it the juggernaut that is the Marvel Cinematic Universe. DC was also in decent hands too at Warner Brothers. Both companies weren't going anywhere, and fans could sleep soundly. With the internet becoming an ever-growing thing in the 2000s as well, the way we bought comics changed too. The digital age had begun, and very few people were buying physical copies anymore, aside from the diehards and collectors that is. Today, I will be counting down my picks for the top 5 best comic characters to come out of the 2000s decade. If I miss any of your favorites or ones you believe should have been included, let me know in the comment section down below. Let's begin. At number 5, we have the third major symbiote from Spider-Man stories, known as Toxin, the offspring of Carnage and the last truly interesting symbiote character in my opinion. Toxin's host is former NYPD officer Patrick Mulligan, who was given the symbiote by Carnage in order to hide it from its parent Venom, with the intention of killing it and Mulligan at a later time. While originally quite weak, the Toxin symbiote would mature and grow just as strong as Venom and Carnage, and unlike those two, doesn't try to take over the mind of its host body. The Toxin symbiote is rather childlike by nature, but can still become violent if provoked, growing just as large and intimidating as Venom, if need be. At number 4 we have Thomas Elliot, Hush. Debuting during the 2002 to 2003 storyline Batman Hush, Elliot was a childhood friend of Bruce Wayne who always seemed to beat him in strategy games. He would show Bruce how to think like his opponents and use their own abilities against them. Tommy was born into a wealthy family, but unlike Bruce, despised his parents. Wanting to be on his own and inherit his family's wealth, Tommy had the brake lines of his parents' car cut, which caused them to be in a serious accident. His father was killed, but his mother was miraculously saved by Bruce's father, Dr. Thomas Wayne. Tommy would eventually kill his mother too after years of being forced to tend to her, mind you, but always resented Bruce because his father saved her. On top of that, when Bruce's parents were killed, Tommy felt jealous that Bruce was able to achieve independence and acquire their fortune, something Tommy had longed for with his parents. All in all, Hush is a character fueled by hate, envy, and personal desire. Some consider him overrated and uninteresting, but I disagree. I think he's quite dark and disturbing, a sinister take on the idea of wanting independence. He's fascinating. Moving on to number 3. I've decided to group two characters together here, Atrocitus and Dexter. Atrocitus is the powerhouse leader of the Red Lantern Corps that draw their energies from anger and rage found within the emotional spectrum. Dexter is one of the most feared members of the Corps and Atrocitus's pet. He was a homeless blue cat from Earth named Dexter, who was placed in a sack and hurled off a bridge by two ruffians after his owner was killed. A Red Lantern ring sensed the rage inside his heart and attached itself to his tail. I did a breakdown of the character a while back if you want to check it out. For number 2, I'm going with Professor Pig. I was introduced to this character thanks to 2015's Batman Arkham Knight video game, but after reading more up on him, he's become an instant classic, easily standing side by side with some of Batman's greatest villains over the years. Pig is a complete psychopath who kidnaps people and surgically mutilates them to fix their imperfections in his eyes. He turns them into mind-controlled Dollartrons and runs the criminal group of lunatics known as the Circus of Strange. For the honorable mentions, we have Rick Grimes, the main antagonist of Image's Walking Dead series, that made his first appearance in 2003. Another character that was introduced in 2003 was the Great White Shark from Batman stories. In 2004, we have Scott Pilgrim by Brian Lee O'Malley. Debuting in 2005, we have Kick-Ass, Larfleeze, Mr. Negative, and the Winter Soldier, and in 2008, Anti-Venom, a twist on the character Venom that acts as its symbiotic brother. The death of Jason Todd, the second Robin, in 1988's Death in the Family pissed off a lot of people because the final vote to kill him out of the 10,000 submitted came down to a difference of only 72. Yeah. But if not for his death, Jason Todd wouldn't have been able to come back 17 years later, resurrected by Ra's al Ghul and his Lazarus Pit, into the anti-hero Red Hood. After coming back from the dead, Todd would initiate an all-out war on Black Mask's criminal empire in Gotham City, and seek vengeance against those that wronged him, mainly the Joker, the man who killed him. He comes face to face with Batman, and the Dark Knight's morality comes into question. Without a doubt, Red Hood is by far the greatest character to come out of the 2000s decade, at least in my opinion. I feel he made the biggest impact. Here we go with the final installment of my top 5 characters by decade series on the decade we currently find ourselves in, the 2010s, which is over in a few short days. Like all my previous lists, I chose these characters based on impact, significance, and my own personal preferences. If I miss any of your favorites or ones you believe should have been included, feel free to leave them in the comment section down below. Starting off the list at number 5 is the Batman Who Laughs that debuted in September of 2017, making him the newest character on this list. The Batman Who Laughs is an alternate version of the Dark Knight that exists within DC's multiverse, and is a freaky hybrid of both Batman and the Joker. This character is new, but he caught on real quick with fans, and has appeared in several crossovers and his own series since his inception. Just to look at him, it doesn't take much to realize why he made an impact. He haunts my dreams. For number 4, we have Carol Danvers, Captain Marvel. Though Danvers debuted in the 1960s for Marvel Comics, she wouldn't take the mantle of Captain Marvel until 2012. The Captain Marvel character has been a wide variety of individuals over the years, from the Kree, Mar-Vell, to the Earthling, Monica Rambeau, to the Skrull, Connor. But the character and its series were never really that popular and didn't sell very well. The only reason there were so many incarnations is because Marvel has to publish a Captain Marvel title once every few years in order to retain their trademark over the Captain Marvel name, which they swooped down and snatched up after the DC Fawcett legal fiasco over the original Captain Marvel, Shazam, had taken place. Anyways, Carol Danvers is by far the best and most interesting of all the Captain Marvels, at least in my opinion. And thanks to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Marvel Comics finally has one that is really breaking ground and connecting with audiences, not to mention has so much more mainstream attention now and appeal. At number 3 we have Kamala Khan, the 4th person to take on the role of Miss Marvel, following Carol Danvers, Sharon Ventura, and Carla Sofin. Khan is an Inhuman who discovered her Inhuman genes following the events of the 2013 Inhumanity storyline. She possesses the ability to shapeshift and stretch her limbs, and is Marvel's first Muslim character to headline their own comic book series. Not only is she a really fun and interesting character that provides great commentary being a modern-day teenager, but she's a symbol of equality, diversity, and feminism. She's the full package. Definitely one of the greats to come out of this decade, without a doubt. Number 2 is the Court of Owls that debuted in 2011 as part of DC's New 52 continuity. They are a secretive, conspiracy-level group, sort of like the Illuminati, consisting of some of Gotham's oldest families that use their wealth and social influence to transform the political landscape of the city to their liking, usually by killing people, that sort of thing. The higher-ups and leaders wear creepy owl masks to cover their faces and conceal their identities, but a lot of the lower-ranking members are actually human-owl hybrids, which is even creepier. Their elite assassin forces are known as Talons and remain in a form of slumber deep within their inner sanctum until they are called upon to execute someone. Fun stuff. Honorable mention time. First up, we have Hitmonkey, Detroit Steel, and Taskmaster's daughter, Finesse, making their first appearances in 2010. Next is S.H.I.E.L.D. agent Phil Coulson, a character that debuted in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but has since found himself appearing in multiple comics throughout the past decade too, starting in 2012's Battle Scars. The White Lantern Corps, which were introduced in the Blackest Night storyline in 2010. Spider-Gwen, also known as Spider-Woman, and Ghost Spider, debuting in 2014. John Kent, Superboy, and the creepy Mr. Bloom making their first appearances in 2015. And finally, Kay Quaid, also known as Kid Kaiju, and the Deadpool knockoff Gwenpool, created to cash in on the popularity of Spider-Gwen, both debuting in 2016. The greatest character to be created in the 2010s decade, though, without a doubt, has to be the Miles Morales Spider-Man. Originally, he was part of the Ultimate Marvel Universe, which shares a separate continuity than that of the main universe, following the death of Peter Parker in that one. But after the Ultimate Marvel imprint ended, he was made a character in the main Marvel Universe too, which was great. Miles is just as interesting as the original Peter Parker in my opinion, in his own ways, and is a positive role model for kids all around the world, regardless of their ethnicity or upbringing. It doesn't matter. In fact, the 2010s feature a lot of characters like this, which is great. Comics have reflected the ever-changing world. Anyone can be a superhero, and it's about time we were all represented with these stories. Well guys, that concludes my series looking at the very best characters created in each decade throughout comic book history, spanning the 1930s all the way up until today. I know it was a long time coming, me finally getting around to finishing these videos and capping off the series, but I was busy focusing on my other stuff and kept pushing it back and pushing it back. I apologize. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to the channel, hit that bell icon to be notified of all future content I release. I'll be back soon with more villain breakdowns, comic verse screens, as well as comic and game reviews, and help support me on Patreon if you'd be so kind. It helps me out a lot. I will see you all in the next one. Take care and stay nerdy.